Let's hope that works. Good morning, everyone, and good morning. Lovely to be back and see everyone. This is just a one-off. This is just a one-off share, and then next week I will be off again to our travels. But it's fantastic to be back despite the snow and the weather. So today I thought we'd just do a one-off looking at, I will talk more fully about my sabbatical on another occasion. Hopefully the Shabbos perhaps address a little bit, but for now we'll get straight down to business. And I thought just as a one-off, carrying on the series of Jewish thinkers and their times, talk a little bit about the Ibn Ezra, because he connects to many of the other ideas that we've been discussing over the last few months. First of all, just to contextualize him, he was born, we don't know exactly when he was born. He was born somewhere around 1090, perhaps 1089, 1092. Like a lot of famous figures, we know his death date well, because by then he was famous, and therefore his date of death was recorded, but we don't know his birth date exactly, but called it 1090, and died in 11, actually, we don't know exactly his death date. We know it was January in the late 1160s, but roundabout lived into his mid 70s. He just to give the headlines of what Avraham Ibn Ezra was, and I suppose to give the punchline of what I plan to say today. He was a Mefarish. That's what he's most famous for, his commentary on the Torah. He was a Bal Pshat. His focus was on Pshat in the Psukim, rather than Medrash or halachic explanation of the Psukim. He was a Bal Medakdek. He was a grammarian of fame, and really had significant impact in introducing grammar, more precision and understanding of grammar. He was a Python. He wrote beautiful poems, including many of the Zemiros for Shabbos that we love. Tzoma Nafshi, a song of great passion, and my soul is thirsty for Hashem. If I had time today, I don't have time, I would go through the Zemer. It's one of the most beautiful Zemiros imaginable, and just to read the words and the poetry and how he weaves so much into the text. He was an astronomer and an astrologer. So astronomy is what we would nowadays call scientific, the study of the planets and the stars. He was also an astrologer. He believed in the impact of the Kochavim, the stars, and the Mazolos, the zodiac, on human affairs. He was a rationalist, meaning he focused on philosophy and science. He's part of that great sort of Spanish Andalusian school of rationalists, of which the Rambam was a more famous proponent several decades after the Ibn Ezra. But despite being a rationalist, he believed in astrology. Gives you an indication of how hard it is to be a rationalist, right? How do we actually know astrology doesn't make sense? Maybe the stars do impact on our fate. Well, nowadays we don't believe that. We have no scientific evidence for it. But if you're in the year 1000 and you're a rationalist and you're trying to understand the world scientifically using reason, what would necessarily tell you that that's not part of the nature of the world, the science of the world? Maybe just like there's other scientific, who would have ever dreamt that the moon has an impact on tides? That can also sound mystical, but now, of course, we know it's scientifically true, so maybe the stars somehow do have an effect on psychology. The Ibn Ezra does believe in that. In fact, in his honor, one of the craters on the moon is named after him. Abenezra is named after him. The punchline of the share, I suppose, will be that I'm going to argue that whilst his Zemiros are still sung, a couple of his Zemiros are still sung, his Piyutim remain astoundingly beautiful, whilst his commentary is still learned, I would say that the ultimate long-term impact of his thought has not been that significant in the long-term trends of Jewish philosophy. And I will try and demonstrate that he in the end did not end up formative in Jewish conversation about Jewish ideas and philosophical ideas. But let's step back a little and just give a little overview of his life, and then I'll try and give a trace of where he was impactful, which is in Peshat, and where he wasn't impactful, which is really in the realm of philosophical ideas. Okay, so he's born, as I said, in somewhere around 1089, 1092, died somewhere around 1164, 65, 67. Just to contextualize that, the Rambam was born in 1138. So the Rambam was born when the Ibn Ezra was about 49. so he's older than the Rambam. The Ibn Ezra traveled all over the world. He had a terrible life. We'll talk a little bit about that later. And he did go to Egypt. And there are a number of legends about the Ibn Ezra meeting the Rambam in Egypt. We don't think it's true. There's no record of it. Neither the Rambam nor the Ibn Ezra reference it. No contemporary sources reference it. It's only later sources, and we think the dates don't work out. The dates that Ibn Ezra was in Egypt were not the dates, did not overlap with the dates that the Rambam was in Egypt. So it's intriguing that these two phenomenal figures, as far as we know, did not have a conversation with each other. Maybe I'll take at this point, as we mentioned, the Rambam loved the Ibn Ezra as far as we can tell. He saw the Ibn Ezra as a predecessor of his in thought. He didn't agree with everything that Ibn Ezra wrote. The Rambam was very skeptical about astrology, did not believe in astrology. And I think we've discussed this previously, a famous letter the Rambam wrote to the Chachmei Montpellier, to the sages of Provence in South France, who were very fascinated by the Rambam's thought. And the Rambam asked them, they asked the Rambam, how can you reject astrology? Surely Chazal accepted astrology. And the Rambam says, not true, not all of the sages accepted astrology. Some did, some didn't. You have to follow the majority. The majority didn't accept astrology. And anyway, and then a very famous quote from the Rambam that I've often quoted before, God created us with eyes in the front of our heads, not in the back of our heads, to show us that we need to look forward in life, not backwards. And sometimes ideas develop, and you need to be open to accepting how ideas develop. And we now know that astrology doesn't make sense. So he was critical of that aspect of the Ibn Ezra's thought, but in other respects, as far as we know, appreciated very much the Ibn Ezra's Pshat-based commentary on the Torah, very rationalist commentary on the Torah, appreciated the Ibn Ezra's rationalism as a philosophical system, and recommended his works. The Rambam wrote a letter to his son, a last sort of will and testament to his son. The Rambam's son was Avraham. And as far as the academics dispute whether this letter is genuine or not, but academic consensus seems to be emerging that this letter, this document, is authentic. And as far as we know, it's a genuine letter. And he writes very strongly encouraging his son to learn the works of the Ibn Ezra, and says, if I would have met the works of the Ibn Ezra earlier, it would have impacted even more on my thoughts. So again, we're very used to an age of instant publishing, but even though the Rambam and the Ibn Ezra came more or less from the same part of the world, from Spain, they had similar travels, they both ended up in Egypt. Nonetheless, the rate of flow of information was very slow in those days, and it seems the Rambam only met the Ibn Ezra's writings nearer the end of his life. And if this letter is authentic, he says, I wish I had seen it earlier. So he highly recommends the Ibn Ezra to his son. If this letter is authentic, the Rambam also is very critical of the scholars of France and Germany, the Ashkenazi scholars, of whom, of course, there's the famous commentary of Rashi, who preceded the Rambam also. The Rambam writes quite dismissively of the French scholars, who he says eat too much meat and garlic, and engage too much in pure halachic learning, and don't think enough about philosophy and the like. So the Rambam is critical, if this letter is genuine, of now. The Rambam writes very strongly there. Whether he would have written in those terms is difficult to know, but definitely the idea that Torah can't just be lomdus and halacha, but also needs to be philosophy, is in line with the Rambam's thinking. And it's true that the French scholars didn't engage in what the Rambam would have recognized as philosophy. One of the things I've tried to show with all my teaching of philosophy is that the Ashkenazi Chachamim, of course, had a very deep and profound philosophy. They just didn't use necessarily Greek terminology, and we've spoken before about the difference between Shakespeare insight into psychology and modern day methodological psychology, the difference between art teaching truth about the world and science. Of course, the Chachmei Ashkenaz had a very sophisticated thoughts about the world, but not in the philosophical language, and certainly not in the language of the Greeks that the Rambam recognized and wanted, and he was very critical of that. But he liked the Ibn Ezra. He liked the Ibn Ezra's thoughts. Can someone just nod online, because I'm using my phone, not my machine? Am I being heard? Is this is all good? Okay. So that's Rabbi Avraham Ibn Ezra. His commentary, I would say, in some respects, was Rashi's chief competitor for becoming the standard commentary on the Torah. It's a discussion for another day. I don't think we've ever looked systematically at Rashi, and maybe one day we should do. Rashi as a great thinker and look at his life and times. But we sort of take for granted that we live in a world where Rashi is canonized. Rashi has become the commentator on Tanakh and the commentator on Shas. But was this always the case? Did Rashi have any other competitors? How quickly did Rashi's commentary spread across the Jewish world and become a standard? And were there any rivals for that position of dominance? And the answer is that yes, there were rivals. Rashi's commentary spread astoundingly fast and very quickly did become canonized as the standard commentary on the Torah. But there were pockets of resistance to it, particularly in the world very heavily influenced by the Bali Pshat and by the Rambam and the Ibn Ezra, who didn't like Rashi's what they saw as Rashi's midrashic focus, and the Ibn Ezra for a time, whose commentary almost rivaled Rashi's. Rashi's commentary took off ultimately because the later commentaries were crazy over Rashi's Pshat, and to Rashi was ascribed the right of the firstborn, the right of becoming the commentary. And the Ramban, for example, who lives 100 years later, 130 years later, wrote his famous commentary in the Torah, in which he references a lot Rashi and sometimes disagrees, but Rashi is really the father of commentaries. The Ramban, Nachmanides, we're talking about over here. So again, Nachmanides in his famous commentary in the Torah it promotes Rashi, as did many others, to all conversations on Torah always start with Rashi. Every drasha, every pshat, we say Rashi lines like this, and then maybe we'll explore greater depth in Rashi's explanation, or argue in Rashi, but Rashi has become the sort of the start of the conversation, and that's because later commentaries treated Rashi that way. But the Ibn Ezra also was an important and remains a very, very important voice in Pshat. The Ramban, Nachmanides, in his introduction to the Torah, says, I have a terchocha megula, an open rebuke of the Ibn Ezra, and an avon isteres, a hidden inner love. What does he mean by that? Because in his commentary, a lot of the time, he fights with the Ibn Ezra. He disagrees with the Ibn Ezra. He says, I want you to know, just because my terchocha, my rebuke, my disagreement with Ibn Ezra is megula, is revealed, but the avon isteres, there's a deep love there. I don't want anyone to think that I reject the Ibn Ezra as a person or don't appreciate his work. I'm giving him the respect of disagreeing with him, which reveals how important his commentary is. But the Ramban is a representative of the later Spanish school of Mukabalim, and he doesn't agree ultimately with Ibn Ezra's worldview and Ibn Ezra's style of commentary, but many times he does agree with Ibn Ezra. It's not as if he always disagrees, but in his introduction he writes this famous line of Avon Nisteres, there is a hidden love, even though to Chacham Megillah, even though I sort of ostensibly rebuke and disagree with the Ibn Ezra. What else can we say about the Ibn Ezra's life? So let's just run through his life. He's born in Tudela in Spain. Tudela is in North Spain in Basque territory, in Basque country. And he wanders around. Spain at the time is in influx. It's the time of the Muslim-Christian wars. So Spain from the 700s had been part of a Muslim empire. Slowly the Christians fight back, and if you picture the geography, they basically fight south. So gradually Muslim Spain gets pushed towards the south. Of course, the complete reconquest is only fully completed in 1400s, but Ibn Ezra is living in this time of flux. He's born in Tudela when it's Muslim. He then moves to Cordoba, which is Muslim. Then Cordoba gets reconquered. Then Tudela gets reconquered. It becomes Christian. Ibn Ezra runs away. Then a fanatical set of Muslims take over the southern part of Spain, the Almohads, who the Rambam later runs away from also. The Rambam, born in Spain, has to run away from Spain. He runs away to North Africa and then runs to Egypt eventually, where he encounters a moderate form of Islam. The Ibn Ezra has a similar journey. He has to run away to Italy. He travels through Europe. He's in France. He gets caught up in the Crusades. Never, can you imagine? Get caught by Christian persecution, then you get caught by fundamentalist Islamic persecution, then you get caught up in the Crusades. In France, he travels to England, London. I mentioned already in previous times his famous letter of Shabbos. Let me just remind you about that because it's a very, very interesting letter. And he is murdered, as far as we know, in England by a mob. And possibly buried in England, possibly buried in Spain, possibly buried in Italy, possibly buried in the Galilee in Israel, but as far as we know, murdered by a mob in England, according to some reports. So a whole range of. You can find his cave in Eretz Israel. It's reported in Eretz Israel. It's reported as being next to Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, who we discussed in our previous series. We'll come to their relationship again. I'll remind you about their relationship again. He had a very, very tough and miserable life. I think I mentioned to you his poems, some of his poems. Previously, he wrote the famous lines that if I worked in the wax making industry, the sun would never set. if I worked in the Chevra Kaddish, if I got a job as an undertaker, as a shroud maker, people would stop dying. He never, his livelihood was awful. But basically, one of the most beautiful and staggering minds of the 1000s and of the 1100s and of the of Jewish thought was a vagabond, a tramp, trekking across Europe, homeless. It's just the mind boggles to think what he went through. He met the Bali Tosfos in northern France and engaged with them in learning. He was respectful towards them. He liked them. He met the Rashbam, as far as we understand. As far as we know, he spoke to Rabbi Nutam. So these are the generations after Rashi who are engaged in halachic discourse, very significantly, who the Rambam perhaps is very critical of. Interestingly, they perhaps take Peshat too far for him. So just to a brief history, we've spoken before a lot about Peshat and Medrash. Rashi launches a Peshat revolution in which he cites a lot of Midrashim, but Rashi is always looking for the Pshat in the Pasuk. Rashi's grandchild, the Rashbam, takes it even further and writes a very, very Pshat-based commentary. And the Ibn Ezra once overtly attacks this Pshat commentary and says you've gone too far, and once indirectly attacked it. The Ibn Ezra is a Pshat commentary, so let's just remind ourselves what that means. He tries to learn the simple understanding of the Pesukim, but sometimes we have a problem. Does the simple understanding always match how Chazal understood the Pesukim? A very extreme example is the famous ayin tachas ayin, an eye for an eye. Well, is that the simplest understanding of the Pasuk, or does it mean a monetary payment like Chazal say? Why does Chazal say it meant monetary payment if the Pasuk says eye to an eye for an eye? So we discussed that at length when we spoke about how actually in the Pshat of the Pasuk, that seems to be the simplest Pshat. But there is this tension between a halachic understanding of Pesukim sometimes and the simplest meaning of the Pesukim. And then you have Medrash, in which Medrash tells stories about people, often also not in line with the simplest Pshat understanding of Psukim. A very famous example is Nimrod. Nimrod is described as a Gibor, Tzayid of Hashem. He hunts in front of Hashem. Chazal understands him to be a terrible Rasha. The Ibn Ezra says, well, it sounds like in the Pshat of the Psukim that he's hunting for Hashem, maybe to hunt sacrifices, to offer korbanos in front of Hashem. Who says he's this wicked figure? So when it comes to Medrash and stories, the Ibn Ezra says, you know what, we can learn Peshat, and if it's against how Chazal understood the story, okay, you know, that's the area of Peshat. When it comes to halacha, we should not be going against Chazal. If Chazal reasons a Peshat in a pasuk, so maybe we can say own Peshat. But if Chazal had a Kabbalah, an understanding, they after all were the Bali Masurah, they were the ones who had the tradition of the Masorah of how the Pesukim were meant to be understood from Moshe and onwards. The Ibn Ezra believes in Torah Sheba'al Peh. He is no Karaite. In fact, he engages in dispute with the Karaim, the Karaites who flourish from the era of the Gaonim all the way through to 1300s and still exists to this day as a very small minority sect. They ostensibly try and paskin halacha, they try and rule based upon the pshat of the psukim. Ibn Ezra is very, very critical of such a style. He says we have to be careful when Chazal have a Masurah tradition, how to understand psukim, we dare not tread against that. The Rashbam is happy even in areas of halachic pesukim to say, no, the pshat says something different. I'll accept halacha. Rashbam is the grandson of Rashi, is one of the Bali Tosfos. He engages in halachic learning. He writes a Tosfos, one of the most prominent Tosfos commentaries on the Torah. He's not chas v'shalom, a rejecter of Torah Sheba'al Peh, but he's happy to give pshat against real iconic Torah Sheba'al Peh interpretations, because he says this is the simplest understanding of Psukim. That's a chelek of Torah. That's a legitimate way of learning Psukim. And the Ibn Ezra attacks this. I'll give you two examples of this. One is the famous Igeres HaShabbos, the letter of Shabbos that the Ibn Ezra writes. He wrote it in England. And he says, I had a dream in which the Shabbos came to me and complained that people are not keeping Shabbos properly, and he writes this very, very powerful letter written as if it's Shabbos speaking, bemoaning the lack of respect. And one of the points he says in this is that there are those who dare imply that Shabbos starts in the morning and finishes at night, rather than as per how we understand the Jewish day, which is it starts in the evening, in the night, and then carries on to the day. In other words, the evening follows the evening precedes the day, rather than the day preceding the night. And this is of profound halachic significance. If you suggest otherwise, you change the whole structure of Shabbos and Yom Tov and the whole sort of nature of the Jewish calendar. Now, where would such an idea come from? So the Ibn Ezra doesn't reference where it comes from. However, in a manuscript version of the Rashbam's commentary on the Torah, the Rashbam references the famous psukim of Vayihi Erev, Vayihi Boker, which Chazal understands to indicate that the evening precedes the morning. But the Rashbam translates differently. Vayihi Erev Vayihi Boker Yom Echad, Vayihi Erev Vayihi Boker Yom Sheni, which he understands to mean it was evening, it was morning, and with morning the first day starts, with morning the second day starts. So the Rashbam says that in Peshuto Shel Mikra we can understand the posuk of Vayihi Erev Vayihi Boker not to mean that they, how do you say, and it was evening and it was morning one day? Does it mean it was evening and it was morning and then the day finished and with that the first day was completed, so night precedes day? Or no, it was evening and it was morning and now day one begins. In other words, the day is the beginning, is the start of the halachic time frame. Now, or the Torah's description of time frame. Now, the Rashbam did not mean to argue with Halacha L'Maisa. The Rashbam certainly kept Shabbos on Friday night. Again, he's a Baal Tosfos, he's a profoundly halachic observer, but he's willing to say Pshuto Shel Mikra can mean something different. How would you resolve that with halacha? Maybe say, okay, this is veracious. This is a description of the natural flow of time. The halachic flow of time doesn't have to match the natural flow of time. After all, in seasons, for example, we start the Jewish year in autumn, not in spring, right? We start the Jewish year Rosh Hashanah in autumn, not in spring. In a way, paralleling that. So halachic time doesn't have to overlap with natural time. The Yom Tovim are both agricultural festivals and also national festivals. The daytime, also the halachic day, doesn't necessarily have to match the natural day. In fact, there are areas of halacha where the day does precede the night. For example, in the Beis Hamikdash with Karbanos, we bring a carbon in the day, and the night follows the day. So the Rashbam isn't bothered with this idea. He somehow can live with a multi-tiered Torah in which Peshat can say something profoundly against the most basic halacha imaginable of night and day. Ibn Ezra doesn't like this. He writes his Igeres HaShabbos against this, perhaps against the Rashbam. He doesn't reference the Rashbam, but perhaps against the Rashbam. But in another place, he does reference the Rashbam. And this is again in the Pesukim of Kriyas Shema, where we say that we should put tefillin. The tefillin should be bound to the arm and attached to between the eyes, in the forehead, to the head as tefillin. Now, is that actually what the pasuk says? Well, not quite. In Pshuto Shel Mikra, the pasuk says, "V'hoya dvarim eila shanu yishlim mitzaf chayom." These words which I am commanding you, Allah v'avecha, they should be on your heart. And you should teach them the time of the debate upon Mishivtach v'Yisef, v'lechta v'derech, v'shach v'kmecha, etc. Now, when the pasuk says they should be on your heart, when it says you should teach them to your sons, what's it talking about? The words. The words should be on your hearts. V'shenamtem, they should be familiar in your speech. You should learn them, and they should be a sign on your arm and a totophos. Who knows what that word means? Right, famously difficult word to translate. Perhaps a signpost between your eyes. What does that sound like? And it carries on. When should you say these words? When you travel on journey, when you get up in the morning, when you go to bed at night. What does the pasuk mean in Pshuto Shel Mikra? Take these words and live with them. When you walk on the way, have these words. When you teach your children, teach them these words. When you walk through the doorway, think about these words. These words should be as a guiding post to your arms to know what to do, and to your eyes to know where to look and what to think about and how to live your life, how to steer yourself. So the Rashbam says, in Pshuto Shel Mikra, these words do not mean placing tefillin on your hands and your heads. They mean give yourself direction through these words. The Ibn Ezra goes crazy. He says that's not how Chazal understood these psukim. That's not how Jews have understood these psukim for 2,500 years. We got the Torah from Sinai, and we were given this Torah on Sinai, and with that came an understanding of it. How dare you suggest other b'shatim? And you will unwittingly lend support to the Karaites if you teach this sort of idea. Now, again, the Rashbam, to be clear, Chas v'shalom, he's not rejecting the mitzvah of tefillin. He puts on tefillin. He's part of a famous controversy about how tefillin should be written. Rabbi Nutam and Rashi, the Baal Tosfos, of course, are doing these things. But the Rashbam is willing to give a pshat in a pasuk he says this is the pshat understanding. Halacha is a separate level. Again, I don't want to go into this in too much detail. I simply remind you of the lengthy series that we gave of the relationship between pshat and medrash, in which pshat and medrash can operate on a multi-tiered level. And Chazal had this understanding, and Bali Pshat in the Ashkenazi world had this understanding that the Torah has a multi-tiered approach. We take this so for granted nowadays. Elu ve'elu devilikim chayim. These and these are the words of the living God. Shivim ponim the Torah, 70 facets to the Torah. Pardes, the 4 levels the Torah can be learned on. Shak, Remez, Drosh, and Sod. So we sort of have learned to accept the Torah as this multi-tiered text that can be understood on multiple levels. The Ibn Ezra accepts to a degree the idea of multi-tiered understanding, but in a much more limited way. And he says that there is a limit beyond which you shouldn't step. Pshat cannot contradict the received tradition of Chazal in how they understood the pasuk halachically. You can take pshat when Chazal suggested a pshat. You can argue with that. So you can give your own pshat. When Chazal have a midrashic reading about a story, you can argue with that. But when it comes to halacha, surely halacha defines the parameters of what is and isn't legitimate, not just in what we do, but also in how we interpret a pasuk. Certainly when it comes to received traditions of Chazal in how to understand psukim. Okay, so just to summarize what we have said so far, the Ibn Ezra is a dazzling figure, an astrologer, an astronomer. He travels across Europe, meets the Baalei Tosfos, a very important bridge. He's there in Egypt, probably before the Rambam, doesn't overlap with the Rambam, but certainly part of that cultural, that sort of world of Andalusian philosophy. He's a rationalist, but he's also an astrologer. He's a scientist. He's an incredible Python and poet of renown. And beautiful Zemiros. He's a polemicist. He writes the Sigaris HaShabbos and other such works. And he's an important figure in the development of Pshat, the renewed interest in the simplest understanding of the Psukim, and writes a very, very impactful commentary on the Torah based on that. I'll just try and tell you a few more stories about his life, and then sort of go through a few of his works and discuss a little bit his philosophy. I mentioned that the Ibn Ezra knew Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, who we discussed recently. This is very important, by the way, because in many ways you can describe the whole of Jewish thought as a debate and a conversation between Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and the Rambam in his Meir Nevuchim. I tried to explain that when we looked at the Kuzari text. The Rambam never references Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi preceded the Rambam, but you can look at Rabbi Yehuda Halevi historically as almost a response to a sort of Meir Nevuchim type approach. The Rambam, when he wrote his Meir Nevuchim, was reflecting a trend within North African and Spanish Jewish thinking that had become very Greek and very philosophical. And the opposition to this was expressed by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, even though he preceded the Rambam. So the Rambam, who's the most clear and fullest expression of a philosophical approach to the Torah, is critiqued in a sense by the Rabbi Yehuda Halevi who precedes him. We saw the Rabbi Yehuda Halevi in his conversation. He writes the Kuzari, this sort of artificially generated conversation of debate between the king of the Khazars, the Khazars, and the rabbi. And in it, the Kuzari very much argues for a particularist model of Judaism, not a universalist model. Who is the Hashem that we know? God who met our ancestors, who took us out of Egypt, who gave us the Torah. The ultimate way of knowing Hashem is through tradition, through the tradition of the revelation at Sinai, not through philosophy. He irritates the king. The king wants to hear grand, sweeping universalist vision, and Yehuda Halevi chooses the particularist one. So you have this debate between the two figures, and then you have the fascinating figure of the Ibn Ezra, who is very close to Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. They are friends. In a moment we'll see, perhaps they are family, perhaps not. But they are certainly friends, and they know each other. And the Ibn Ezra, who is this rationalist and in some ways a reflector of the Andalusian philosophical tradition, is also very, very close to Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. So you have Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, who's crazy over the Ibn Ezra, and you have the Rambam, who's crazy over the Ibn Ezra. So it gives you an idea of the magnitude of the Ibn Ezra. But I would say, just to reiterate, that perhaps because of this, ultimately, the Ibn Ezra did not make, in my humble view, a long-term contribution to Jewish philosophy. He made an important contribution to grammar, to Peshat, as a Mefarish, but we don't have from him outstanding philosophical ideas that stood the test of time and remains part of the Jewish conversation. And maybe for that reason, he could cross the bridges both between Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and and the Rambam, I don't know, but that's just my suggestion. And what is his relationship to Rabbi Levi? There's lots of legends out there. Perhaps a cousin, perhaps a son-in-law, some say. We don't have a record of him being a son-in-law. It seems to be a later idea. In his lifetime, neither Ibn Ezra nor Rabbi Levi refer to themselves as having that relationship. There are some early sources that suggest he's a cousin of Rabbi Levi. They definitely know each other. It's possible he's a mechutan. In other words, it's possible that Rabbi Levi's son, the Ibn Ezra's son married Rabbi Levi's daughter. So that may be the relationship, and that may be where the son-in-law confusion came. I mentioned already another legend, which may or may not be true. Probably part of it is true. If they were cousins, then we would assume that Rabbi Levi and Ibn Ezra knew each other previous to this story. If they're not cousins but mechotonim, then maybe they didn't know each other. But the story goes that Rabbi Levi, that Ibn Ezra in his wanderings across Europe, turns up at Rabbi Levi's house, and Rabbi Levi welcomed him in as a guest, as a vagabond, as a tramp. Ibn Ezra, as I said, was poor, had no money. He was clothed in tattered clothing, and Rabbi Levi welcomed him into the house and assumed he was just an ignoramus, regular person. One point in the stage, Rabbi Levi doesn't come home on time for lunch, and his wife sends the tramp Ibn Ezra, she doesn't know it's Ibn Ezra, to call him from the Beis Medrash, and Ibn Ezra finds Rabbi Levi stuck in learning. And that's why he's late for lunch, because he's working on a sugya and unable to leave it. What's the sugya he's working on? He's trying to write a piyut. Writing a piyut is a very, very skilled art. It has to be poetry. In Spanish poems, it has to have a very, very formal structure with a set number of syllables and words and rhythm to it. He's writing a poem which is sung to this day, a piyut sung to this day called Mi Kamocha, sung by the Sfardim on Pasha's Zohar, which is a summary of the Megillas Esther story. And he's up to the letter Reish, and he can't work out how to continue the message he's trying to give in with the meteor and the rhythm and the tone of the poem, the style, in a manner that's appropriate. The Ibn Ezra says to him, "Time for lunch. Why are you delaying?" Rabbi Levi says, "I'm stuck." The Ibn Ezra gives a glance over at the poem, picks up immediately the rhythm, the syllables, the meteor, the style, the language, where the story's up to, whips out a pen and writes the next line in the poem. Rabbi Levi is blown away by the genius of the man and realizes that this tramp is no common tramp, and eventually becomes family with the Ibn Ezra, either takes him as a son-in-law, as a mechutan, thus goes the story. What part of that story is true or not, we don't know. What we do know is that this piyut of Mi Kamocha, sung to this day by the Sfardim, has two verses for the letter Reish. And the Sephardi tradition is that one verse was written by the Ibn Ezra and one verse was written by Rabbi Levi. So there's no reason to doubt that tradition. Whether the rest of the story is fanciful or not, I don't know. But certainly if the Ibn Ezra was his cousin, then it doesn't seem to fit. If he's Mechutan or his son-in-law, maybe it does fit. We don't think he was a son-in-law. There's no record of that, but Mechutan could well be. Either way, it gives you an idea again of the genius of the Ibn Ezra. Whilst I'm mentioning his family, we don't know exactly, but possibly he had 5 children. Possibly 4 of them died in the Ibn Ezra's lifetime. Possibly all 5 of them died in the Ibn Ezra's lifetime. Again, terrible life that he led. He had a son, Yitzchak, who may have been the only son who lived to adulthood out of his 5 children. And Yitzchak ended up also as a traveler, ended up in the Middle East, in Baghdad, where possibly he converted to Islam, perhaps going off the derech, or perhaps under force. Possibly came back to Judaism and did teshuvah, possibly not. Died, though, before his father died, and we know about this because Ibn Ezra writes a poem of terrible pain about his son, and love combined with pain at what his son did and the decisions his son took. He's critical of his son at the same time as loving, and it's just one of the most terrible texts possible to read. You just see the emotion there and the pain that Ibn Ezra felt. I mentioned already that Ibn Ezra is buried in, well, we don't know where he's buried, but according to legends, he's buried next to Rabbi Levi. And there's a cave that people ascribe to him, and some reports say that Rabbi Levi was buried next to him. It ties up to whether Rabbi Levi made it into Israel or not that we spoke about, or died on the way. Okay, what else can we say about Ibn Ezra? As I said, he moved to London, then to Oxford around the late 1150s, 1158, and then in the middle to late 1160s, probably 1167, age 75, he died. He moved to Oxford, by the way. I said in London and then Oxford. In Oxford, he wrote an important work, he Soid Hamora, and then in the 1160s died, murdered in North London, actually, north of London, somewhere around here. London in those days was what we would think of as the city, central London, and on a road north of London, quite possibly Finchley Road A41, that's an old Roman road, somewhere along there, he was, as far as we know, he was killed by a mob, so around here, quite remarkable. Let me just run through a little bit the extent of his works. I mentioned already his Perush on Tanakh. He wrote his Perush on Tanakh twice, possibly because he lost one of his manuscripts and wrote it again. We have both manuscripts. We have Perush Aruch and Perush HaKotze, it's called. The one printed in the Siddur, in the Chumash, I'm sorry, the famous Mikvah's Gedolos commentary that you see of the Ibn Ezra is his Perush HaKotze, his short version of his commentary. We also have a Perush Aruch, a longer version of his commentary on some Psukim. We don't know why he wrote twice, but it seems that it may be because he lost his manuscript and from memory wrote a sort of shorter version of his manuscript. He wrote a philosophical work, Yesod Meir, which I mentioned already, on exclamation sign mitzvahs. He wrote about mathematics. He wrote books on grammar. He wrote books on astronomy. He wrote books of history. He wrote books of astrology. And he wrote polemical works like the Igaris HaShabbos. And so much else also. I'm going to perhaps just stop talking about his. I mentioned Zemiris, by the way. I mentioned his Tomo Nafshi and Kiyesh Shabbos, by the way, another very famous Zemer that he wrote. Also, he wrote many more. As far as we know, he probably wrote more than 100 books. So again, quite amazing. This prolific author traveling as a tramp across Europe. One of the greatest tragedies of Jewish history, by the way, I'll just mention, is that the poem that he wrote about his son appeared in manuscript in the 1930s and was put on sale in Europe, and collectors wanted to buy it, and the person who found the manuscript wanted an enormous sum of money, and no one could afford it. So no collector bought it, and it was lost in the Second World War. Little fragments have come to life, so we know something about it, which is why I mentioned his son Yitzhak, who rewrites about the Pagan's death. But we lost this. Can you imagine a work of Ibn Ezra that was rediscovered in the 1900s and then lost again? Very, very, very sad. Okay, let's just spend a little bit of time talking about his ideas, some of his philosophical ideas. Okay, let me mention a few of them. The Ibn Ezra wrote his commentary on a very short, it's very, very brief, and thus very hard to understand, which may be one of the reasons why his impact in the long term on Jewish philosophy was limited. He also self-censored, meaning he was nervous to fully say his ideas and hinted at them and called them soyid or secrets. And I just want to share with you some of his secrets. And by the time I finish sharing them with you, maybe you'll understand why he wanted to keep them secret. Confusingly, he also uses the word soid for when he wants to give a mystical interpretation of the pasuk. By the way, to this day, Kabbalists refer to what they do as soid. Ibn Ezra was not a Makubal, he wasn't a Kabbalist. When he referred to soid, he meant the secrets of the Torah, he meant astrology. So he believed that a lot of Torah can only be understood through astrology. So if you want to understand the big day Kohen Gadol with the Choshen and Ephod and these stones and these mystical stones and the different markings on them and the clothing that he wears with all the mystical symbolism, the only way to really understand it is by understanding astrology. This is the route, one of the routes through which we can connect to the divine, and therefore the Kohen Gadol clothes are a means of connecting to the divine. And many other ideas in mitzvahs, that Ibn Ezra explains the reasons behind the mitzvahs as linking to astrology. In other words, he sees the stars as impacting on human affairs and as a route through which to connect to Hashem, and explains mitzvahs like this. So sometimes he'll use the word soid like a secret, a mystical reason behind this. This idea has left, I would say, no impact on the long-term Jewish thought. No one went with him on this. The rationalists, the Rambam, opposed these ideas. So those who supported Ibn Ezra in his rationalist endeavor didn't like this aspect of his work. The Torah very strongly condemns engagement with astrology and belief in the impact on our lives. It could be many thinkers think that when the Torah condemns it, it doesn't mean there's no such thing as astrology. It simply means we shouldn't use that. Tomim's here. We should relate directly to Hashem and not worry about these astrological ideas. The rationalists, the philosophers, don't think astrology exists at all. So no one likes what Ibn Ezra says that this isn't a meaningful way of avodas Hashem. So this is an area where his sort of, I suppose, his impact didn't really have lasting impact. But then the Ibn Ezra also uses the word soid to describe other important ideas that he wanted to say. And I just want to share a couple of them because these are difficult ideas and they deserve to be addressed. Anyone who has dabbled in learning about the Ibn Ezra will know about the history of one of his ideas. So to give a little bit of background, there is a problem with the last 8 psukim of the Torah, in that they describe the 8th last pasuk of the Torah describes the death of Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, how can Moshe Rabbeinu write a pasuk describing his death if Moshe is indeed the author of the whole Torah, as we understand? How can Moshe write the last psukim of the last psukim of the Torah? So the Gemara in Baba Basra addresses this. And the Gemara says that 2 explanations. Either Moshe Rabbeinu wrote these psukim, and he wrote them b'dema, he wrote them crying. What exactly this means that he wrote it crying is a subject of debate, but Moshe wrote it, Moshe is a novi, Moshe can write things with nevuah. Moshe writes them in the past tense. Well, this is a phenomenon that we know from the rest of Nach. It's known as the prophetic past tense, in which Nevi'im, who are clearly talking about the future, describe events using the past tense, because prophecy is so definite that they can use the prophetic past tense to describe future events. So that's one explanation of the last 8 psukim. The second explanation of the last 8 psukim that the Gemara Mabasra gives is that Yeshua wrote them. So Yeshua wrote the last 8 psukim. Now, the Rambam, in his Ikrim, writes that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote the whole Torah, every single word, and anyone who questions this is flirting with heresy. Thus writes the Rambam. So before I say anything else, I want to be absolutely clear that we are dealing with very, very tentative ideas and ideas that are connected with Ikrei Emunah, and we have to be quite cautious what we say around them. Having said that, the Rambam is aware that the Gemara Baba Basra brings the possibility that Yeshua wrote the last 8 psukim. Now, if Yeshua wrote the last 8 psukim, what do we mean when we say Moshe Rabbeinu wrote the whole Torah? And the answer is the Rambam paskins against this view. He paskins like the view that Moshe wrote every single word and that he wrote these psukim through prophecy. Does that mean that he thought that the opinion that Yeshua wrote the last few psukim is heretical? Maybe. The Rambam could have felt that the psak halacha meant that to say such a thing nowadays remains heretical. Alternatively, it could be that the Rambam, when he says that Moshe wrote the whole Torah, he means Moshe wrote almost everything in the Torah, but as long as you believe that a Novi, a prophet of the caliber of Moshe, wrote the whole Torah, that's sufficient. And the last 8 psukim were written by Yeshua, who for these 8 psukim achieved the status of Moshe and could write psukim in the Torah. Okay, this is background. The Ibn Ezra, on his commentary in the Torah, points out that if you are going to say this idea, then really it's not the last 8 psukim, it's the last 12 psukim that had to have been written by someone else, because pasuk, the 12th last pasuk starts Vayal Moshe. Vayal Moshe. Moshe went up on the mountain. Now, if Moshe went up on the mountain and never came down because he died there on the mountain, he can't have written even Vayal Moshe. So Ibn Ezra now says actually it was the last 12 pasukim that were written post Moshe. Okay, so far, so good. The Ibn Ezra then, in various other places in the Torah, references psukim and says, I think the only way to understand this pasuk is with the Soid Shteimasa, the secret of the 12. And what this seems to mean is that Ibn Ezra, here and there, with the odd pasuk here and there, is saying this pasuk was written with bearing in mind the secret of the 12, i.e. a later prophet, perhaps Yeshua, added in a couple of psukim here or there. Now, if you do a sum totality of the psukim that the Ibn Ezra says, you come to something like 5 psukim, maybe a total of 30 words in the Torah about which the Ibn Ezra says this, but he was very nervous about this idea, and he doesn't say it explicitly. He says, I want you to reference the Sod Shtei, the secret of the 12. Okay, so just to summarize what we've said so far, there is an ikar, and one of the fundamentals of faith, Moshe Rabbeinu wrote the Torah, every single word of the Torah, the Rambam categorizes fundamental faith. Whenever we are talking about ikar and we have to be very, very sensitive to these ideas. Incidentally, even if the Ibn Ezra said something a little bit counter to this, we don't necessarily paskin like the Ibn Ezra in this area, but we're trying to understand what the Ibn Ezra said. The Gemara references an idea that perhaps the last 8 psukim weren't written by Moshe. The Rambam maybe paskins against this, Gemara not. Okay, 8 psukim were written by a Novi on the level of Moshe, by Yeshua. The Ibn Ezra extends the 8 to 12, and then extends the 12, if you look through the Torah, to another 5 or so examples of this. Just to give you a taste of what sort of areas where the Ibn Ezra was bothered by this, one example is the phrase Eiveh HaYarden, the other side of the Yarden. Now, if you are a Jew traveling through Midbar Sinai and making your way up through modern-day Jordan and then crossing the Yarden, the Jordan River, into via opposite Jericho, and then going into Eretz Yisrael, that's the route of the travellers. When the Torah is being written, where are you living? In Jordan, in the other side of the Yarden. So why would you call the area Eiveh HaYarden? Says the Ibn Ezra, and you answer this question using the secret of the 12. In other words, it's a word put in later to reference from an Eretz Yisrael perspective what that area is. But when you're in the Midbar, that's not the way you would describe it. Now, this is not a knockout blow. You could say Eiveh HaYarden. The Torah was written ultimately from an Eretz Yisrael-centric viewpoint for Jews who knew they were heading to Eretz Yisrael, and therefore it's still referred to as Eretz HaYarden. Eiveh HaYarden, don't forget, they were descendants of the Avos who lived in Eretz Yisrael. So you could say that was the name that Jews gave to that river, Trans-Jordan, Eiveh HaYarden, the other side of the Jordan. So it's not a knockout blow, but the Ibn Ezra didn't feel this was a good answer to the question. And the Ibn Ezra said, no, the answer to the question is Sod Shtei Masa. It's written by it's written by a later prophet, Yeshua perhaps, describing it from an Eretz Yisrael perspective. Now, in and of in itself, I don't think there's anything in this which is fundamentally shocking or theologically disturbing. It's innovative. The Ibn Ezra was nervous about this idea. He didn't want to make it explicit to those who casually learned his work. However, someone who reads his work seriously, you pick up what he means. It wasn't secret, it wasn't hidden. But he didn't want it to be popularly known, known on a casual level unless someone was a serious student of his work, because it's a little daring to suggest that we can come along in the 1100s and pick a pasuk, pick on an odd occasion, and say this is a post-Mosaic authorship. This is it does open a little bit of a can of worms. Came along a much later figure, Spinoza, and amongst his many heretical and controversial ideas was him as the father, not just of a non-traditional theology of pantheism, which we're not going to go into now, but also opening up the concept of biblical criticism. The idea that we can look at large chunks of the Torah and say this is a later edition, this was authored by Ezra, this was authored in the Second Temple era, this was authored in the middle of the First Temple era, and out of that emerged the whole study of biblical criticism and the right assumed by 18th, 19th, 20th century intellectuals to analyze which parts of the Torah are authentic and which parts aren't. And the father of this revolution was Spinoza, a figure we're not discussing today. Maybe I'll give a dedicated talk on Spinoza and what he did and how he emerged. But Spinoza, very briefly, operating in Amsterdam, a ex-Marano, a descendant of Spanish Jews who had migrated to Amsterdam, and very serious philosopher, very, very serious philosopher, and in many ways the father of biblical criticism. And Spinoza says, I have a grandfather of biblical criticism, the Ibn Ezra. So Spinoza noted the Sod Shtei Masa and blamed or licensed his revolutionary ideas on the thoughts of the Ibn Ezra. With justice or not, I would say with no justice. But to be fair, the Ibn Ezra does open a can of worms. The Ibn Ezra definitely did not think large chunks of the Torah didn't come from Moshe. He did say when he wanted to say it. He said it on the odd posset period there. God was, the Ibn Ezra took a view which is not mainstream Jewish view, not in line probably with the Rambam's principle of faith, but he took the view that a later prophet was licensed to give a couple of editorial comments to the Torah to finish off the story with the death of Moshe and to explain a location that would have been unfamiliar to Jews living in Eretz Yisrael, relabeled Eiveh HaYarden, and a few other examples of that. The idea that on a couple of occasions a later prophet can amend something is controversial enough, but he definitely believes in prophecy. He believes this is a Novi, a prophet, who is doing this. He is not suggesting a documentary hypothesis that there are non-prophetic sections to the Torah pieced together. How do we deal with biblical criticism as a genre? Not our subject for today. For those who remember many, many years ago, I think 10 years ago when I first came to know Israel, I gave a series on Wednesday evenings at the time on it. People are interested in it. I can either give a repeat series of it or I can share the recordings in which I gave a very, very serious analysis of biblical criticism and how to approach it from the point of view of being a Marmin. All I want to say in terms of moving forward is that the history of this idea is a Gemara in Baba Basra, extended by the Ibn Ezra from 8 to 12 Pesukim, then in the Sod Shtei are extended further. It is fair to say that in so doing, the Ibn Ezra does open the idea that a later thinker can begin selecting which verses came from Moshe and which ones came later. And in that sense, it opens up the problem it did open up the problem. On the other hand, the idea that Spinoza or later biblical critics can claim that the Ibn Ezra was a secret biblical critic, I don't think has any foundation. Peter, yes.
The use of At Hayom Hazeh. Sorry, I'm talking from Yerushalayim,
Yeah.
so I apologise.
Yes.
The use of At Hayom Hazeh has also caused a lot of controversy, hasn't
Yes,
it? Comes up in a lot of
in my series on biblical criticism, I analyse all these texts. But it's,
yeah.
As I was speaking, I was weighing up mentioning At Hayom Hazeh, particularly because it's a pasuk we just read. So just again, since Peter's raised this, here and there in the Torah will describe historical phenomena, and it will say At Hayom Hazeh, until this day this exists. So, for example, a couple of weeks ago, we read that. Last week we read that Yosef sold grain to the people of Egypt, and in return, eventually they couldn't afford to pay, and they became serfs in the lands. The lands became property of Pharaoh, and they had to pay a percentage of their crops to Pharaoh, a fifth of the crops, and so on. And the Kohanim were exempted from this. The priests of Egypt were exempted. And the Pasuk describes this phenomenon existing as Ad Hayom Hazeh till this day. Now, if it means Ad Hayom Hazeh, like prophetically, that it will always exist for all time, well, it's not true. Go to 21st century Egypt. They do have income tax there, unfortunately, but it's not linked to Paro. It's not linked to the rate of tax. Peter, can I just ask you to mute yourself because I'm getting a little bit of interference. Sorry. It's not an attempt at censoring you, but just so this is so it doesn't mean till this date. So when does it mean till? When is Ad Hayom Hazeh written to? Well, till the giving of the Torah, perhaps. Well, that makes sense in this case because the Torah is given 400 years after the story of Yosef in Egypt, or 210 years after the story of Yosef in Egypt. Do you understand? Moshe is saying Ad Hayom Hazeh. But there are other occasions when Ad Hayom Hazeh is written about things being described in the 40 years in the Midbar, in which case, who put in Ad Hayom Hazeh? And this is part of that sort of broader discussion. Let me just mention a couple of other ideas of Ibn Ezra. I mentioned already his fight with the Karaites. The Karaites, very interesting group, we're not going to go into them now, deny Torah Sheba'al Peh. Ibn Ezra learns their works seriously. Sometimes he will take their pshat and give it weight, and say, you know what, they are good readers of text, and there's nothing in what they're saying that's hashkafically controversial. It's not theologically problematic. It's not against the Mesorah of Chazal, and therefore I'm happy to learn from people who I really disagree with and think are heretics, but nonetheless they've said a good pshat in the pasuk, so I'll cite it. Other times he disagrees with them because he just thinks they're poor Bali Pshat. He doesn't think anyone who is reading the pasuk should read it that way. There's a famous line of the Ibn Ezra. This is a very famous example. There have been many examples of this. The pasuk in Mishpatim describes Shor Re'ehu, which we translate as the ox of the friends of the owner, the colleague of the owner. There was a Karaite scholar called Yitzchaki who translated it Shor Re'ehu as the colleague ox. In other words, it's talking about oxes goring another ox. So an ox gores its friends another ox, Shor Re'ehu. The Ibn Ezra doesn't think oxes have friends, and therefore he thinks this is a poor pshat. There's other reasons why in the order of the Psukim he thinks that the Yitzchaki got his pronouns wrong. He says, Ein l'shor re'ehu chutz mi Yitzchaki. The only friend that oxes have is Yitzchaki himself. So a famous line from Ibn Ezra, and he's quite scathing sometimes of the Karaite explanations because he just thinks they've read the Psukim poorly, they've not been good grammarians. And other times he's scathing because they're going against Chazal. And as I already mentioned, the Ibn Ezra will not go against something which he sees as a Kabbalah of Chazal, as how Chazal traditionally understood the Psukim. He's not willing to tolerate a pshat that rewrites the timings of day and night, or what the Psukim around Tefillin mean, even though he knows the givers of these pshat keep halacha, but he says there's no such thing as pshat that goes against the Kabbalah, the tradition of Chazal, and certainly I'm going to be scathing about the Karaites when they go against Chazal and these things. Yes. Yes.
Or
Yes.
and turning the brain off.
Yes.
And
Okay, so this goes into a deeper question about what is Nevuah of Moshe. There's no indication that the Ibn Ezra takes a non-traditional view about this. He takes a traditional view of this. He understands Nevuah Moshe to be Moshe as the Mechokeik, Moshe as the transcriber of the given Torah. And I want to emphasize he sees the whole Torah as prophetic. At no point does he chas v'shalom suggest, a la Spinoza and later biblical critics, that there's humans messing with the Torah in any way. He simply says that there could be other Nevi'im who wrote like Yeshua, who wrote a pasuk here or there. And in essence, the Gemara says that about the last few pasukim of the Torah. Ibn Ezra is not suggesting on any part of the Torah is non-prophetic, and any part of the Torah isn't an accurate transmission of Hashem's words. He simply is opening a can of worms. It is true that some of this may have been added post-Moshe, and that's where it gets controversial, why it does open up the pasukim. Let me just mention a couple of other ideas of the Ibn Ezra. One idea, which is quite in line with many other rationalists, but Ibn Ezra says this in his commentary, is the Psukim in Hazinu that talk about the Seirim, which are translated as Shadim or demons. The Ibn Ezra doesn't think there's such a thing as demons. He says it's a state of mental confusion. It's an inner psychological experience rather than an external absolute. And in that, he's in line with the rationalists. When a Ruach Ra, an evil spirit, possesses someone, they understand this to be biblical language for describing an inner mental turmoil or anguish or confusion, rather than something external. Another comment about the Ibn Ezra, I'll just say two comments about the Ibn Ezra, and then I'll finish. I don't want to go over time. Another comment of the Ibn Ezra, two more comments of the Ibn Ezra. One is there in his commentary on the Torah. The pasuk says, "Vayita Hashem Elokim gan be'Eden mikedem." Hashem planted a garden of Eden. Vayosam shama sa'odom asher yotzah. He placed there ha'odom asher yotzah, the man that he created. Now, one of the problems with the chronology of the Torah from a modern perspective is the age of the universe and everything else. Again, I don't want to go into all of that now. I've given extended shiurim on that. But there is a question, a textual question, when you read the Torah about is Odom an individual or a name, a proper name? Is it just a description or is it a class of people? For example, when we say in the Ibn Ezra gives this example, Shevet HaManashe, the tribe of Ha-Levi, the Levi, we don't mean an individual called Levi, we mean someone who is a Levite. So the Ibn Ezra, to the best of my knowledge, is the first classic commentary that mentions this point, and he says, Ha'odom, hey Ha'odom, yesh lo soid, it has a secret, gam nimtza shevet ha-Menashe. So the Ibn Ezra seems to be hinting to the idea that this being created in Gan Eden, we shouldn't think of as an individual, but we should think of as humankind, the human species, a representative of the human species, and an individual in the human species. Those who want to understand Bereshis as not telling us the chronology of one human, but of a human species, cite this commentary of the Ibn Ezra. Again, I don't want to go in depth into something that's beyond the scope of this discussion, other than just to mention it, and we can look in more detail at Age of the Universe. There's an Ibn Ezra which we do not have in manuscript, but it's quoted by contemporaries of the Ibn Ezra, in which the Ibn Ezra looks at the ages, the extraordinary ages in Sefer Bereshis, in which figures last 1,000 years, and he says these refer to eras of history. It'd be a bit like, I don't know, saying the Elizabethan era lasted, or the Tudor, let's go in there properly, the Edwardian era, the Georgian era lasted for 300 years. I don't know my English history well enough, or British history well enough to know if that's correct, but you don't mean the individual life of any person, you mean an era named after Victoria or George or Elizabeth or the Elizabethan age or whatever. So that's what the Ibn Ezra understands in this quote to be these, 1,000 odd years that figures live. He says these were leaders of the generation, and when it says they lived and they died, it means that their reign, their dynasty, lived and died in that age. So these are important quotes. Theological ideas, I'll mention one other theological idea of the Ibn Ezra, which I'll finish with. And again, I just want to emphasize that these ideas have not really left a long-term impact on Jewish thought. One of the big problems in monotheism and it's something we've discussed again and again, is how does an infinite being relate to a finite creation? And we discussed this when we looked at the Kabbalists and symptom, this idea of divine limiting and spread and so on. It's one of the big points of theology, how to deal with this issue. There is a very, very controversial statement of the Ibn Ezra around this. The Pasuk, again, not that long ago that we read, describes Hashem speaking to Avraham and telling him about the upcoming destruction of Sodom. And it precedes it by saying that Hashem says, I've heard reports, the voice, the cries of the Zak of Sodom have come to me. Erdonai, I will go down and Ve'era, and I will see Hakosa Habai Lai Osu. Is it like the cry that has come to me that I've done? In which case, Kala, I will destroy them. And if not, Adar, I will know what to do. 1 minute. What does this pasuk mean? Hashem, it doesn't know whether Sodom did what it did and didn't do what it didn't do. And he has to descend to have a look at what's going on. Very, very strange language. Now, generally, we understand this as metaphor. And the Rambam established very, very clearly that the idea of anthropomorphisms, Yad Chazaka, the strong hands of Hashem, Zroya Natsuya, Eine Hashem Lekechaba, is a metaphor. What Hashem is saying is, I'm going to apply the midah of din to this. The Ibn Ezra makes, again, one of his unclear comments. Ki ha'emes, the truth is, Shahakol Yoda Kol Chelek Al Derech Kol. God, the Kol, the all-encompassing one, knows each part al derech kol, on an all-encompassing level, veloy al derech chelek, but not on a particular level, unless he chooses to pay attention to it. So Ibn Ezra, if we understand, again, 4 or 5 words of the Ibn Ezra, very, very difficult words to understand. Ibn Ezra seems to be saying that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as our Kol, who knows everything, doesn't always engage with individuals with a conscious connection to the individuals, unless he so chooses to do. Now, what on earth does that mean philosophically? I mean, if God can know everything and is unchanging and above time and space, what does it mean that he doesn't know everything? What does it mean for God voluntarily to choose to suspend knowledge? This really gets us into the whole problem of monotheism. What does it mean to say symptom, that God chooses to give us free will? How does that accord with being an infinite being? To what degree can God contract his relationship with the world and give space for humans to exist? And if he can he also do it in the realm of knowledge and interaction in the way that Ibn Ezra seems to be implying? Ibn Ezra seems to have been grappling with this problem and suggested, uniquely in Jewish thought, that God disengages sometimes from detailed knowledge of what human beings do and ultimately re-engages with them. The whole point of the story of Sodom is Hashem re-engages and restores justice, but it's possible for him to suspend his universal knowledge of the particular on occasion. No one really knows what to make of this philosophically, and to the best of my knowledge, it's had no particular impact on Jewish thought. You can choose to say, look, I don't think there's resolution as to how the infinite interacts with the finite, and God forbid reject monotheism as a result of that. It is one of the serious intellectual problems with emunah that needs to be dealt with. And many great thinkers have dealt with this, and we've discussed answers in the past about how to deal with this. But I don't think this Ibn Ezra's idea of how to deal with it has left a lasting impact on Jewish thought. What is this compromise that he doesn't know but can choose to know? It's a difficult idea to understand and hasn't entered mainstream Jewish thought. Yes. 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 There are many better answers to this pasuk. Well, I don't say better, but there's alternative mainstream answers to the pasuk, and there's alternative philosophical ways of dealing with God's knowledge of human affairs, which we've discussed at length. The Rambam famously deals with it, but this is what Ibn Ezra says. I want to finish off with one line, which is one of my favorite quotes, and then I know everyone has to go, but let me just finish this with one line, and then I will stop. And I referenced this line secretly when I spoke about Rabbi Levi, and I wonder if there was a correspondence between the two. And this pasuk needs to ring in our ears. This line of the Ibn Ezra, needs to ring in our ears. And the Ibn Ezra, in his introduction to his commentary, speaks about the importance of human reason. And he says, the malach, the angel that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us as an intermediary between us and Hashem, is the seichel, is human intelligence. We have to see human intelligence as a gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, given to us. And this is the angel, the messenger that Hashem sends to us to allow us to hear his voice and for us to speak back in turn. Now, I remind you of the piece I said at the beginning of Rabbi Levi, in which in the Kuzari's story, what leads the king to embark on his intellectual journey is a dream in which the malach comes to him and says to him, your intentions are good, but your ma'asim, your deeds are not good. And I asked, if the Kuzari is trying to write a book of Jewish thought about how everyone has to go on an intellectual journey, how can he bring a dream of a king that triggered the journey? That's not fair. The king had the dream. Why would you construct a dream as the trigger of the king's journey to intellectually searching for truth, if you're trying to write a book about how everyone should search for truth? And the answer I gave is that Rabbi Levi is saying everyone has this dream. Everyone needs to hear a malach, an angel inside them, saying, you need to know what to do in life. You can't just live a life of wandering around without actually thinking about what you're doing. It's not enough to have kavanas, good intentions. You have to actually do things and to work out what it is that we need to do. And it's not enough to be a philosopher. You can be a philosopher and live a thoroughly corroded and corrupt life. And the whole point of the Torah is to teach us a good life. So the Rabbi Yehuda Levi doesn't see this construct of a king having a voice urging him to go on an intellectual journey to discover religious truth, because he thinks everyone has this dream. The dream is the subconscious voice of a voice that we all need to have this nightmare of a malach appearing to us. And I said that the malach is the messenger of Hashem, which is our consciousness and our conscience and our reasoning. And I just simply want to say this beautiful line from the Ibn Ezra, in which he says, the greatest malach that we have from Hashem. If you want to meet a messenger of Hashem, we all have a dream, wouldn't it be wonderful to meet a malach? The answer is you can meet a messenger of Hashem. The greatest messenger of Hashem is the faculty of human reason that we've been given, and if for nothing else, that line remains eternal, as does the beautiful piyutim of the Ibn Ezra that we sing. I wish I had time actually to. I try and sing Some Nafshi as much as I can on a Friday night. It's such an incredibly beautiful song. I'd read two lines from the song, just two of my favorite lines. He describes, this is a bit gory, but I'm living at the moment in Yerushalayim, and we used to live quite near the great Sanhedria cemetery there. And on the lines of the Sanhedria cemetery are lines that Ibn Ezra writes in his Zemeh, Beis Moyed Kol Chai, the meeting point of all living people. And I used to do my commute every day. I used to go past the sign, and I used every day see Beis Moyed Kol Chai, the meeting point. And again, without getting ourselves too depressed, it's not a bad way to live a life to be reminded that this base Olam, meeting like the base Moed Kol Chai. One line from Ibn Ezra, he uses a beautiful metaphor of the story of Shlomo HaMelech, in which the two women argue whose baby is it, who's alive, as a metaphor for the debate between the Christians and Jews, who is it, whose baby is alive, who's got real continuity. Incredibly, Sama Nafshi Elokim Lekel Chai. My heart thirsts for the living God. Libi Basari Lekel Chai. My flesh and my heart sing praise to Hashem. These are indescribable. You see the towering, magnificent spirituality of the Ibn Ezra in his songs and his poetry, and that lives eternally. I hope I've managed to share a little bit of what the Ibn Ezra was with you all. And I look forward to when we're back next, also doing a one-off share, hopefully. I wish everyone a good day. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.